Hello, and welcome back to Slipper Camp. It is the dinner hour, and yet you are all here, and I'm really grateful for it. And I've been grateful for all the stuff I've learned today and all the participants. I am going to share my screen to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges that we face this semester and we may face in the fall when students don't have good connectivity. So let's pick this sharing of the screen. And you guys are going to tell me if you see the presentation style or the full deal. The full deal?
Right now it's the editing.
I'm seeing your unmentionables.
Editing.
That means I have to start again and pick a different one. Let's try this. How's it look? Good. Okay, so, unfortunately, this was a big challenge for lots of folks this spring. And unfortunately, regardless of what you hear in this PowerPoint from me right now, it's going to remain a big challenge for us in the fall, assuming that we are either hybrid, online, or high flex, or any of those things that require online learning. It really is, I think, kind of stark when you look at the framework that we've put together, because obviously this session tonight is designed to be really looking at equity. Like that's the point of this conversation. But if you look at everything inside of this framework, obviously most of this is about engaging through technology in the semester. So what that means is that however we frame the pedagogy of it, if technology and modality are central to the conversations that we're having, I am having personally just a really hard time having those conversations without starting every time with, please, let's talk about connectivity, let's talk about Wi-Fi, let's talk about hotspots, let's talk about laptops, let's talk about data plans. So the point of tonight's session is not just to look at that equity column, but also to realize how almost all the cool stuff we might want to pedagogically inflect depends a little bit on some of these issues that we need to solve. One of the things you've probably heard lots of people talking about is the difference between emergency remote teaching and online learning. So lots of people said about the spring, hey, don't use this to determine whether you think online learning is effective, or like, we are not online learning, right? Most of us, I mean, gosh, what did people who were teaching, did you have like, I mean, especially if you took spring breakout, right, and didn't quite know what was coming, you had a matter of days, and actually in some ways a short number of days to prepare for this, what everybody's been calling a pivot, which is, a total euphemism for holy hell, I have to find a way to make my class run. So one of the questions about fall is, where on the continuum from holy crap, I'm totally unprepared, and oh, now I'm teaching online as if I had intentionally designed this to be an online experience. And I think one of the things that I want to point out here is that none of us, even if your class was originally a fully online class and designed to be online, none of us in the fall are going to be doing pure, unadulterated online learning. We are still going to be stuck in emergency remote teaching because so many of our learners are going to be affected by the traumas around COVID and by the ways their circumstances have changed. So what we're going to do today is really more about thinking about this as a continuum and how we can take some of the emergency out of this situation for our students if it's possible. So I'm going to kind of focus on 3 levels. I don't really know like what these levels are exactly, like something like things to think about helping. How do we help our students? How do we help our syllabi? And how do we help our institution/system deal with some of the challenges around connectivity. I'm actually going to start with talking about our institution, and I'm more confused than I used to be about talking about our institution, because I used to be clear that it was very much Plymouth State. The challenge now is twofold. The first is the consolidation in IT, which means that when we talk about solving problems around technology, now that that's consolidated at the system level, that's a little bit more higher level conversation than it used to be, right? When I was talking more to people who are laterally on my team. So that's one piece of it. The other is that the emergency situation has made the Board of Trustees much more important in terms of making decisions about balancing the finances of the institution. So I'm getting the impression that many things are at a system level now. So how can we deal with that when we know that some things are just beyond our ability as faculty to deal with? They have to be dealt with more systemically or institutionally. So I want to start by talking about that. For PSU and /USNH, some of the things I was thinking about, and thinking about this session different maybe than some of the others, thinking about it as like, hey guys, we are faculty, we are staff, I'm going to guess primarily faculty in this group. What do we need? What do we think our students need? And what should we really be standing up for with our institution to say, can you help us do this? So there's some things I think that we are working on and even got moving for the fall a little bit. So for example, we know we have these laptops to check out at the library. So it took us a few days because no one could really see the gravity of COVID. So at first it was like, oh, we don't loan those out, you know, for any extended period. Until of course we realized, like, of course we do, right? So one of the things we did is we started, you know, more or less giving those out and signing them out. One thing I think we need to think about for fall is, how do we want to handle that more systemically? Like, can we say, maybe it's month to month, right? And if you need it for more than a month, you'll just check it, you know, renew it like you would online any book. How many of these exactly do we have, right? What are the policies going to be on if something happens to them, right? We've got to work all of this out. I think faculty could advocate for that. Parking lot hotspots are something that most institutions are quote unquote offering, because you don't have to offer it. It's already there, right? Come park here. And we do know that students and faculty at Plymouth State were using our parking lots as hotspots. The system actually advertises a map of these hotspots across our system. So if some of our students live in Concord, for example, they can use the Granite State parking lot. I started thinking, okay, what is a way, you know, parking lot hotspots, I mean, this is trash, right? It's horrible, we understand that. First of all, what do you need to use a parking lot hotspot? Mostly a car, right? It's kind of hard to just like walk your way to one unless you're super, super local. But perhaps we could do things like for the warmer months, like could we offer picnic tables with tents over them so that people could work outside in socially distanced configurations. So I'm starting with the lowest kinds of fruit, you know, to see if we can make some of these things more planned. But then we get to some of the things that we might want to advocate for. So I've been talking with a consultant who works with, I don't know how you say it, Martha, you probably know, WCNet, whatever that is, WCE.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes, I do know. WCE Net. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I don't know. I've only seen it in print. So, but it's a big group, and it has like lots of tech stakeholders who belong to it. And there's kind of a, I don't want to say a charity wing, but there's a wing of that group that works on making tech more accessible. So there's a consultant there whose whole job is to work with institutions to help them set up arrangements using for-profit major companies and carriers who are willing to offer free deals to people who can't afford connectivity. So one thing that we did is that we put together a website where it's like, you can talk to Spectrum and you can talk to Verizon and you can get this and you can get that. And the cognitive overload, even just for me, balancing that stuff was very high. If you've ever tried to change your cable plan or change your Verizon plan, or understand what the difference is between data and your carrier. Like, how do you know that? So obviously for students who are in crisis, it's a really heavy lift to set those things up in one-offs, one at a time. And my personal feeling was that when I talked to students who were having trouble with connectivity, that none of them were really using those resources very effectively. So I think another thing we could do for, as faculty maybe, is advocate that we set up some institutional deals on that. There's different ways that this could happen. You can have Wi-Fi hotspots that are actually hardware that the university can check out, and people can use those. But what I heard, a lot of best practice folks were talking about the fact that many students, even students who are living close to the poverty line, often have smartphones because it's so difficult to live without one now. And that means that if we can get them data, they can often use their smartphones as the Wi-Fi hubs to tether. So that is really easy because we can set up those data arrangements with carriers, and we don't need hardware, checkouts, whatever. My problem that I ran into when I started working with this consultant and Joanne is that then Joanne went and got another job, and she works for the system now. So who does this work? My feeling is I'd love to draft up a little proposal that says the faculty at Plymouth State want us to look into these things, and just send that up the chain. So part of my reason for being here is to say, hey, maybe at the end of this session, we can talk about, if I draft this up, can I take the folks who are in this session and maybe start there to get some signatures and some revisions. Another possible thing we might ask for are, if we are able to get data to more students, then perhaps really cheap Chromebooks. You know, Chromebooks are not great for people who don't have connectivity, but if we can get them connectivity, then the $230 Chromebook actually becomes a bit useful. So perhaps we can take our laptop pool from 30 to 100 if we're able to do that. This also would mean surveying students, because we probably don't want to say, come to Plymouth State and get a laptop, because we can't give out that many laptops. But I have heard many times that we brag that like 96% of our students come with laptops. It seems more doable to get 4% of our students laptops, but that means we have to do some good surveying before fall to find out who's lacking connectivity and who's lacking laptops. Lizelle. I happen to see Liz. I can't see the rest of you.
Sorry, just in terms of the 4%, I wonder, because I just know this was an issue for some of my students who are at home with younger siblings who are sharing one laptop in the whole house. So that number might, you know, we might want to bump that up a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that's also a huge problem for connectivity too, right? Because even if you get them the data, if you're sharing that amongst 4 people, and we're going to talk about some of that a little bit later, but originally I was going to go into this PowerPoint and I thought we would just brainstorm, but what I think I will do instead is maybe just draft the shell of something and leave some space. But I think asking for less will be more effective than being like, here are the 60 things that Plymouth State thinks you need to do. But if we can think about some of these things as we go through the presentation, you might get more ideas. But my idea is that we work on advocacy in addition to the in-course stuff that we're going to talk about next. So I'll kind of set this aside because it's like, you know, above our control level, but I think there are things we can do. Before I go on, does anyone else want to like say anything about this or chime in?
I was just going to add one thing that I came in a couple minutes late, but some of us just don't function well on a screen all day. So I know we're trying to resolve the connection issues and the computer issues, and I support that completely, but I think there's also the Luddite in me is saying, can't we like mail books, mail things, and something else along the way? It's just
the Luddite in you is going to become increasingly happy with this PowerPoint as we
good.
So I think it's a great point too. That was Amy, right? Is that Amy? Yes. This connectivity issue sort of presupposes the idea that if we are going to do remote teaching, it's going to be almost impossible for a student to be successful if they don't have some ability to connect. But I would say the flip side of that coin is that some students, even if we get them quote unquote connected, there's no way a large portion of our students are going to succeed unless we de-tech a little bit. Like if we throw every flashy bit of technology that we have into this, we are going to cause our students to fail. Because you'll see from some of the comments coming up, even the most outfitted students don't have the bandwidth, whether that's here or online, to deal with this amount of technology flow. I know I certainly don't, and I can speak from experience because I've been on this Zoom call since 7:30 this morning. So let's keep going and talk about some of these lower tech approaches, because I totally agree. So now that we get into like what it is that we do, because I've quickly realized what I do not do is set up consultant contracts for carriers, you know, as this guy was talking to me about, what do you want to set this up with Verizon? I was like, oh, dude, I'm an early Americanist. I don't know what you're talking about. But we know our syllabi. So here are some things we might think about putting into our syllabi or thinking about as we're designing the construction of our class. The first is something that lots of us started doing maybe like a year or two ago, Liz, I don't know. We started thinking about basic needs statements in our syllabi. So we started making sure that students understood that, for example, if they were food insecure and hungry, that we understood that that was going to impact their ability to be successful in our classes. And so that we had some resources that we could potentially target towards them, but also that we just wanted to acknowledge that we are a person with whom it's safe to talk about your basic needs, because we consider them academic needs. Now, when I've done that in the past in teaching, I've not personally included technology as a basic need for a few reasons. First of all, I think earlier in my career, first of all, I started my career really before the internet was a basic need, right? When email was more of a fancy party trick than anything else. There are people who argue now that internet is a basic human right, just like water and just like food. We can get into that, but I think one thing we might agree on, whether you think that's true or not, is that if you do have a remote learning semester, it's pretty gross not to think about tech as a basic need. So one thing you might think about is having a basic needs statement, because we know from Rochelle the other day that those are going to be really impactful now. But maybe thinking about the role technology plays in that, and acknowledging to your students that you don't expect that technology is something they all have easy access to. You can also think, and this also of course comes from open education and from emergent learning, which lots of us have been talking about in the last few years. Could you develop the technology expectations for the course with your students as opposed to before you meet your students? So some things that people do, for example, they'll poll their students to ask them what kinds of technology they have access to. And there's also, it's nice to get them to describe that access a little bit so that you know whether it just means like if they really have to, they can get, you know, on the internet, or whether it means, yeah, I have really good high-speed internet all the time. So polling them, asking them what ways they like to stay connected can be really helpful. And then when you notice that there are discrepancies, asking your students to help you figure out what the comfortable ways to engage could be a way of going forward. As we go through this list, there's some of these things will be hot linked in the slide deck, and then there's a lot of links at the end. A lot of these talk about the specific things you can do to decrease the bandwidth that your course takes for students who have trouble with that. And I will tell you, probably most of your students do have trouble with that, because most of us have trouble with that at certain times. I've been giving like big webinars from my house, and Zoom cannot keep up. This is absolutely challenged by the fact that I have a high schooler who's required to be on Zoom at certain times. So what happens if I have a synchronous call scheduled at the same time as she does? My very good internet cannot keep up. So there are lots of recommendations about how to keep your image files smaller, so that when students are downloading them, you all remember, not you all, but some of us of a certain age remember the days of call-in internet, right? Where you were really cognizant of how long. I remember downloading songs from whatever the hell we would get them from. I don't remember, but remember it'd be like, oh, I'm going to download this song. It's only going to take 7 minutes or 30 minutes. So these problems are still real for lots of folks. And some of the files, my God, sending a PowerPoint file, right? We think it's a great offline option to let somebody have a sort of downloaded PowerPoint, but those can be really large files to share. So I do have some links in here that will give you best practice around the size of files. We all probably at this point have heard the caveats about synchronous participation, because streaming can be very difficult. We know there's little workarounds like shutting off your camera, but for some students, that's just going to be almost impossible, not just because of bandwidth, but because of the things Liz was talking about with multiple users being on at the same time, or potentially because of challenges regarding COVID and their schedules. So recording things is best practice, and recording brings us, you know, another set of challenges in terms of being sensitive about who and what you're recording. So some folks are suggesting that we remember the thing that I hate more than life itself, which is the telephone, because most people do have phones and can talk on them. And it's awfully funny how Zoom seems sort of like new and amazing and useful, and yet this other thing that does nothing more than cut your visuals off seems weirdly no longer helpful. If you don't understand how to use Zoom without a computer, that would be a really great skill to have so that you could explain that to your students, because your students can easily participate in your Zooms through their telephone. Easily might be a strong word, but they can participate through their phones. And if you're not quite sure how that works, it'd be good for you to try doing that a few times so that you can really walk that through for the rest of your folks. Lots of people have been doing just regular one-on-one conferences and office hours with students by phone. Whenever possible, if you are using online resources, which can be really helpful now, but the difference is when your students signed up for an online class in the old days, like last 2 semesters ago, they knew they were signing up for an online class, so they had an expectation of online connectivity. But if you're using like a complete online sort of math workbook now, and your student expected to be in Lamson doing all their work, it can be a big challenge. So you may have to look more at downloadable offline assignments. When in doubt, we have, and probably only for a short time, the US Postal Service. So while we have it, let's use it. Liz All would be more than happy to handwrite everyone in the class some beautiful instructions on how to do whatever, and then get a letter back from them. This is actually a really wonderful option, I think, for different kinds of students. It's more like an online, old days correspondence course, but I think you do have to think a little bit about equity when you're doing something like that, because it's going to be a very different experience for a student to communicate with you that way, and only that way, for example. So one thing I would think about, if you do have a student for whom you're going to use working by mail, you might think about it a little bit the way we talked about HighFlex the other day: online synchronous, online asynchronous, face-to-face, by mail. And just make it, instead of saying, oh, you strange student, one person without the internet, make mail another way that your course runs. And you may still have some online requirements there. Perhaps they have to have the ability to get a couple of emails at the beginning, some checking in, but that might be doable for them by going to certain places. I will say one last thing about email, which is that it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's a very simple technology that everybody knows how to use. It's pretty easy for people to get emails on their phones, and most people have an email client working that would be easier for them to access than figuring out an app, depending on what their phone can manage. The other problem is that we definitely hear from students of a certain generation that email is not their preferred way to communicate. We had lots of students, I think, going off the map in the spring because we were sending so many emails and those were going into a black hole. So if you do connect by email, you'll just want to make sure that your students are in fact using that technology. But if they are, you could easily, and actually this is what Phil did, you know, he ran a whole online sculpture class and it went great, honestly, like great. But email was their main course architecture. So their assignments were happening in other ways, mostly through Pressbooks, but all the other thing else was very simply done by email, and it was elegant and fine. If you can find a way to communicate across multiple modalities and multiple platforms, but still organize things so that when they are confused, they know there's one go-to place that will have everything archived. So if you're going to send emails in 10 different places, make sure there's always a storage of a record of that somewhere. And I think Moodle is probably a nice, reliable place to put things like that. I'm just going to keep going because I'm almost done-ish, and then we can chat. But I thought this was really helpful. Daniel Stanford is on Twitter, and I didn't really know his work before I was researching for some of this stuff. And I got so much help, you know, from people who do this kind of work all the time. But there's some really, this is a great little chart about high bandwidth and low bandwidth, and low immediacy and high immediacy. Obviously, some of the best tools we have for education are both high bandwidth and high immediacy. And I wouldn't want them to go away. Like, those things are great. In a global pandemic where students are having trouble finding jobs and eating and getting to school, we probably want to move more towards low immediacy and low bandwidth technology. So it doesn't have to be forever, but particularly for this semester. And if you do it for this semester and you realize that some vulnerable students really respond to your ability to bring them in, you might use some of these techniques after COVID as well. So again, if we're not thinking so much about course design, but just like talking to our students and dealing personally with the humans that we interact with, I already talked about polling your students. I don't think, personally, so you have to make this call for yourself, but I don't think it's an invasion of privacy to ask them those questions about technologies, but I certainly wouldn't do that in, like, when it says poll, I don't mean like, you know, in a public way, unless it's fully anonymous or something. One of the things we've done really well in IDS that I highly recommend to everybody is that when you find a student with an individual challenge or barrier, you ask yourself, is that likely to be a barrier that anyone else would experience? If the answer to that is yes, then try not to make an accommodation for that learner. Try to change the architecture of your course so that learner no longer needs to be accommodated. It's changed the whole face of IDS to do that as a rule of thumb, and I highly recommend it. Sometimes it truly is a quirky, weird situation, and you should absolutely do what you need to for that individual student, but that's rare. Usually it's something you'll see again. We talked already about advocating institutionally, so we'll do that. I would also suggest that if you have tenure, this would be a good time to use it, because we may need to press about how PSU and USNH spends its money. And that is not always an easy thing, and it can feel risky for precarious faculty, for contingent faculty, for untenured faculty, and definitely for staff who might be more likely to be furloughed. I will point you in the at the end here to the COVID-19 emergency funds and the SSF funds. It used to be that you could not use a lot of these funds for technology. Now you can use them to pay for data. You can use them, I think, even for devices and stuff. So that's a new thing. We've also upped the amount that students can get. So they really could use this fund to actually get enough money to pay for the internet for a semester. So that's helpful. I see people laughing. I don't know why, and I don't want to know why. So this is a great suggestion, I think. Do not share resources. Become a partner in navigating solutions. Every time you send a student a link so that they can solve their own problem, I almost think we cause another problem. So many of the students that I worked with this past semester who were impacted by these kinds of issues were really overwhelmed. And what you really do is you send them another task, another thing that they have to do. So if it's possible to accompany the link with, I can help you make this call, or do you want to come at a certain time on the phone and we will do this together while we're talking. This works for me in my own house. When I'm overwhelmed with something, you know, Phil will just sit next to me and literally not even help me, but it's the sense that like, oh, somebody's helping me through this, right? So be a partner to people. When anything happens and you can in any way trace that to connectivity, to poverty, or to health, I would say no choice but flexibility. Like just always say, yes, what do you need? Like we'll make it work. Lots of places to reach out for help. And the biggest thing is when you don't know what to do, probably before you call the collab or Hannah Davidson or Frost, ask your student, you know, what would solve this problem for you? What do you recommend? Because a lot of times they'll know. This is kind of an afterthought to the presentation because I don't fully know what to tell you, except this was not hypothetical. This happened already in the spring to many faculty. Some faculty who live quite comfortably, but made the choice to live in a community that doesn't get Wi-Fi. Those people are screwed, but also plenty of faculty who not only don't have, you know, we do not supply computers for our teaching lectures most of the time. And they, you know, somebody actually asked, is PSU going to provide, you know, data now that, you know, that we're required to be online? No, we're not, you know, we're not, because we're not paying the bills right now. It's very, very challenging. So when we're advocating for connectivity and hotspots and laptops, we have to also think about our teaching faculty who may need those things in order to serve our students. So I'm going to just show you this list. I'm not going to click on any of it, but when you get the slide deck, there's so much cool stuff. And I curated this, you know, not to brag because I really did nothing, except I did some highly active curation because there's a million things out there. These are really great things. So the top two, whatever, right? One of them is our ACE framework, and one of them is, actually, no, the top one is different. So I don't know why ACE is second. That should kind of be at the top as like, that's just a different thing. The rest of these are all really wonderful, prepared webinars, workshops, best practice tip guides, nothing overwhelming, because anything that seemed like TMI for people who were really trying to do this quickly, I took it out. So if you look through those, you'll find all sorts of stuff, everything from, you know, how to use the mail effectively to low bandwidth options like email, to how to resize photos and think about you know, when you want to be async and when you want to be synchronous. So those are some wonderful things that you can look through. And the PSU links on the bottom, I want to draw your attention to the collab resources for struggling PSU students. We'll have to update that again, but that was partially curated by stuff that other folks would notice. So I just want to say, if you notice a very helpful resource, if you put that there, I would love to see that in kind of a more user-friendly format for fall, so that we can feel good about sending that as a link to students and not just like, good luck with your life, here's a link. So if you can work with us on making that site a little bit better, I would be appreciative. I think that's what I have. And I'm actually going to stop sharing the screen and ask you, you know, for your ideas and thoughts and questions if you have them. You can use, I don't know if there was stuff in the chat too, so feel
there were
free.
a couple questions in chat. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Becky wanted to know what Liz was drinking, but I don't think we need to cover that. Liz was talking about, and there was actually some good discussion about an updated centralized PSU basic needs statement and list of resources, and maybe even a version of it that's really focused on hybrid high flex.
So we do have a resource page on basic needs statements, which I will dig out and put on this. It has like some of the old examples, Liz's, Matt's, maybe one from me, I'm not sure. And it also has Sarah Goldrick-Rapp's article and stuff. Liz, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I felt like that was one thing that I didn't update in the pivot or what the hell ever, like, so it sort of remained kind of static and kind of limp. And if we're talking about high flex and we're talking about sort of being nimble, like, and if there's a transition again that's about to happen, can we make those resources, we find out what the counseling center is planning for when, like, we bring everybody back to campus and then we have to send them all away again, or send some of them away because they're sick, or send some of them to the special sick dorm because they're sick. Like, I was so pleased for a brief time with that part of my syllabus, and now I just look at it and it's just like limp. Like,
yeah, it's like we need the food pantry.
Like,
I mean, we can't, like, most
to Plymouth.
things are really changed by,
like, it's good. It was so good for a minute, and then not enough.
Yeah, I think that's a great project because we already have kind of the raw materials of the point of those, and so we can build out that resource site pretty well. I think the other thing I might do is I'll check in with Sarah Goldrick-Rapp, because it will be interesting to see. She's kind of the first person who started talking about the basic needs syllabus, and she researches basic needs and their impact on higher ed success. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Hope Center they have put out a bunch of reports, but maybe asking her to take a stab at some language for us in addition to the resource list would be great. Yeah, I'll definitely talk to her.
Great. Abby also just said she had a question that she wanted to ask about scheduling and accessibility. Are you still here, Abby? Abby, good. She's still here. She's here. She's muted.
Oh, I forgot to unmute myself. Okay. Yeah, I just started talking. No, I forgot. Oh, I remember what I was talking about. Okay. So I think that we're standing in the tension between equity and agility, right? Because I think particularly with this semester, what happened for me were multiple pathways, multiple points of entry, multiple modes of engaging with the class. You can come to Zoom at this time, you can submit this blog post, here are the different ways you can do things, everything's flexible, no deadlines. I'm thinking about the fall in a similar way, but we need to offer predictability, consistency, and stability to a certain extent to students. It can't just all be, because they're already kind of traumatized by COVID. I think sometimes they like the regularity of a particular schedule, but we also need to be, as Liz said, kind of nimble and agile and adaptable, but also equitable. And I think that this is just like the condition of our current context. My question is about this. We keep talking about starting in person in the spring, and I have classes that are scheduled to meet face-to-face during a certain time.
Did you mean in the fall, Abby?
Yeah, I meant in the fall,
okay.
Sorry. And I struggled with, every once in a while I do like small group or short Zoom meetings, and I was teaching an 8 a.m. class, and it was fine, but I didn't feel, I can offer extended office hours and things digitally, but I didn't feel compelled to say, hey, if you want to come talk, you have to come between 10 and noon. I felt like I had been given this scheduling block for presumably in-person classes. And I'm interested in flexible, I want to continue to offer Zoom options that aren't required, that are recordable. I think that kind of worked as one option, but I wonder about how that works with the presumed in-person scheduling, and if folks have thoughts about that.
I mean, I definitely can't answer it, and it's a great question. I do know Zoom was funny because some of the people who were most positive were positive because they were Zooming with a community, like a certain class that they felt really tight with. So a good example is like Phil, one night they had a class exhibition just for their course, and he set up the Zoom and they were there, and it was 2 hours, and then they wanted to keep talking. So Phil said, well, I'll leave you the room, you know, and he left it open, and we went and watched TV, and we went to bed at 11. I was like, oh, don't forget to shut your computer. And we looked, and they were still in there, you know, so that's great. So that was like really amazing. On the flip side, definitely a lot of the negative comments that the collab ended up hearing, because we were, you know, in the middle of things, were students complaining about particularly required synchronous Zooms, and also the poor use of synchronous Zooms, right? Like I'm just lecturing as if nothing's different and you're just sitting there watching. So I think that's one of the problems with the tool, is like this one of the first times I've really seen like, oh yeah, the tool itself is not the point, right? The point is how you're setting that up. Some folks were also asking for scheduling about field experiences, because they were saying, oh, well, if it turns out that we have these little windows of time, maybe we want to do something different with them, where like you're able to go do these certain things that you can only do in certain ways. But what happens about the fact that they're going to run over now Abby's Wilderness Lit class or something? So I kind of wonder, otherwise you're kind of stuck with your schedules, you know, if you want to do synchronous things. I don't know.
Well, I just think like it's not about we all are required to be in the same place at the same time. It's about, I'm going to be here at this time, and here's an option, and we'll record it and we'll share it. But like you said, it's about, we've carved out this schedule for presumed in classes, so I can always assume during this time you might be free. Of course I can assume that, because the pandemic has hit and people are picking up jobs and they're helping with relatives. So it's just a very, I think the word required, right? Like, so we have to get rid of that. We have to figure out what's the breathing room? How can we lift the word required from the equation?
One thing I did, Abby, to jump in, that I did it to try to minimize the change to my schedule and the extra work I had to do, because I think I told some of you here, I felt like I was basically conducting 75 individual enrollments at some point during the end of the spring semester. But what I tried to do was schedule voluntary office hours, or then I started framing them as homework hours, because more students would show up if I called them homework hours. But I would hold them for any class over 3 or 4 different hours throughout the week that were across the 3 different class meeting times that I had. So, you know, they were guaranteed to have an hour or 2 during the time that they would normally meet. But if that suddenly didn't work, now there were 2 other options outside of the originally scheduled option. And I no longer bend it by what subject I was teaching. So if you were in social and you could only come to my research methods office hours, fine, just come in. But I still, again, felt like a really large number of individual enrollments. So I don't know how perfect that solution is.
One thing I'm interested in is, this was in one of the HighFlex articles that I was reading, and I mentioned it the other day. It was really more about how HighFlex started creating these student communities, because the students would take these materials that had been created for the online environments, and they would host their own study sessions and watch parties and whatever else. And I was kind of wondering about that a little bit too. Like, we are doing a lot of effective labor during this pandemic to care for our students and create community. And I don't think we've tapped very many ways to help them do that for each other. And one thing I've definitely seen, and I see this with my daughter as well, who's 16, so not too far off of some of these students, that the effective labor that comes from their peers is more effective, right? So if we can create those communities. So I've been trying to think a little bit about how can we think about using Zoom or meetups or study groups or whatever in ways that don't involve us actually being there. And that could also be something like just getting something started in a certain way and, you know, letting it continue. I mean, we're sort of back on the synchronous Zoom thing, but there may also be other ways to do that kind of thing. I was even thinking about that with mail a little bit as well. Anyway.